The piano had appeared one rainy Monday morning, wheeled into its spot under the wide glass canopy of the city's main train station. It was part of a public art project. A sticker on its side explained in cheerful letters, "Play me, I'm yours." For the first few days, it was a novelty. People gathered around, smiling, as brave souls took a turn. A young man in a band t-shirt played a decent rock anthem. A mother helped her small child press out the tune to Twinkle. Twinkle, little star. The sounds were bright and simple, mixing with the echo of footsteps and the rumble of arriving trains. But as the weeks passed, the piano became less of a novelty and more a part of the station's furniture. Like the newsstands with their bright magazines or the rows of hard metal benches, it just was. Its music became background noise, another layer in the constant hum of the city. Most people walked by without even looking. They were too busy, their minds already at the office, back home, or on the problems waiting for them. The piano's songs were usually fragments, a rushed scale from a passing student. The first few bars of a famous pop song forgotten halfway through, the same simple chords repeated over and over. Sometimes it was painfully out of tune for a day or two until someone came to fix it. Often it sat silent for hours, a big, black, lonely shape in the middle of the rush. The station itself was a world of fleeting moments. Thousands of faces streamed through every hour, a river of humanity. There were couples locked in tight, goodbye hugs, their faces buried in each other's shoulders. There were tourists wheeling enormous suitcases, their necks craned up at the departure boards, looking lost and excited. Business people in sharp suits marched with purpose, the click of their shoes sounding like ticks of a clock. There were tired workers heading for early shifts, their eyes still puffy with sleep, clutching paper cups of coffee like lifelines. The air smelled of wet concrete, cheap perfume, and the warm, buttery scent of pretzels from a nearby cart. It was a place of greetings and goodbyes, of small joys and quiet stresses, but mostly it was a place of motion. No one stopped. Stopping meant you were late, or lost, or had nowhere to go. One afternoon in late October, the light changed. The summer glare was gone, replaced by a softer, golden sunlight that came in at a low angle through the glass roof. It was the kind of light that made even the dusty air look beautiful. The station was in its usual state of organized chaos. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip weaved through the crowd, linked together by a rope, their voices high and excited. A man argued loudly on his phone about a missed delivery. A cleaner pushed a wide mop slowly across the floor, creating a temporary, shiny path dot. It was then that he arrived. He was an old man, coming in from the street through the big automatic doors. The wind outside must have been sharp, because it pushed him forward a little and sent dried leaves skittering in around his feet. He wore a wool coat that had once been a fine navy blue, but was now faded to a soft gray at the elbows and shoulders. It was buttoned neatly all the way up. On his head was a flat cap, its tweed pattern worn smooth in places. He moved without hurry, but not slowly, with a kind of careful precision. In his left hand, he carried a small, old-fashioned leather suitcase. It wasn't big enough for a long trip, just large enough for a few important things. The leather was scratched and soft, the color of dark honey. He didn't seem to be looking for a train. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, scanned the vast hall, not with the panic of someone who was lost, but with the calm look of someone remembering a place. They passed over the destination boards, the coffee shops, the rushing crowds, and finally came to rest on the piano. It was sitting there, quiet and ignored, a few meters away. He stood for a long moment, just looking at it. People streamed around him like water around a stone in a river. A young woman in heels almost bumped into him, muttered, "Sorry," without really looking, and hurried on. He didn't seem to notice. His attention was fixed on the instrument. There was no dramatic smile, no look of surprise. His face, lined with the history of many years, was still. But in his eyes, there was a flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or a deep old familiarity. He walked over to the piano, his steps making no sound on the hard floor. He set the leather suitcase down carefully beside the piano bench, placing it upright so it wouldn't fall over. For another moment, he just stood next to the bench, looking down at the closed keyboard lid. All around him, life continued its loud, busy dance. A station announcement blared, echoing. A baby cried. Someone laughed. Then he reached out a hand. It was a hand that showed its age. The skin was thin, with a pattern of brown spots and raised blue veins. The fingers were long, but the knuckles were slightly swollen, telling of years of use, maybe even of pain. There was a faint, constant tremor in them, a tiny vibration that he couldn't control. He didn't try to hide it. He simply lowered this old, trembling hand and let his fingertips brush across the smooth, lacquered wood of the piano's lid. It wasn't a casual touch. It was a greeting. It was the way you might touch the shoulder of an old friend you hadn't seen in many years. Slowly, he unbuttoned his coat. Underneath, he wore a simple gray sweater and trousers. He smoothed the sweater down, a small, nervous habit. Then he turned and sat on the bench. It was a movement that took effort. He had to brace one hand on the edge of the piano for support as he lowered himself. But once he was seated, his posture changed completely. His shoulders, which had been slightly hunched against the world, straightened. He rolled them back once, a musician's gesture. He lifted his chin. He was no longer just an old man on a bench. He was a man at an instrument. He leaned forward, and with both hands now, lifted the heavy keyboard cover. It swung up and back without a sound. There were the keys, 88 of them, a pattern of black and white that was one of the most familiar sights in the world to some people. The white keys were a little yellowed with age and use. A few had small, dark marks where countless fingers had pressed. The old man looked at them, and for the first time, a very small, private smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was gone in an instant. He stretched his hands out over the keys, those old, trembling hands. He held them there, hovering, not touching. The tremor was more visible now. You could see the slight, shaking tension in his fingers. A person watching might have thought, he's too old. His hands are too shaky. It will just be more noise. He closed his eyes. He took a slow, deep breath, filling his lungs, and then let it out softly. As he exhaled, something amazing happened. The tremor in his hands began to lessen. It didn't vanish, but it calmed, as if the music waiting in the silence was a force stronger than the weakness of age. He opened his eyes. They were clear and focused now, seeing nothing but the landscape of black and white before him. The noise of the station, the announcements, the chatter, the rolling suitcases seemed to fade away, not because it stopped, but because he had stepped away from it into a world of his own. He was perfectly still. The crowd rushed behind him, a blur of color and motion. He was a point of absolute calm in the center of the storm, and then he began to play. The first note was not a single sound, but a deep chord, a cluster of keys pressed together by his left hand. It wasn't loud, but it was full, a low, rumbling wave that seemed to vibrate up from the floor of the station itself. It hung in the air for a second, rich and complex. Before it could fade, his right hand joined in, not with a melody, but with a delicate, high pattern of notes that fell like drops of water onto the surface of a still pond. This wasn't chopsticks. This wasn't a pop song. This was something else entirely. The music that flowed from the old man's fingers was a piece by Sergei Rachmaninoff, a prelude written over a century before. To call it sad would be wrong. It was deeper than sadness. It was longing. It was the sound of memory itself, beautiful, painful, and heavy with the weight of years. His hands, which had seemed so frail and shaky just moments before, were now possessed of a sure, gentle strength. The tremor was gone, absorbed into the music, becoming a part of its expressive, human texture. The left hand laid down a foundation of dark rolling chords, like distant thunder or the turning of a great wheel. Over the top, the right hand wove a melody that was at once heartbreaking and fiercely proud. A woman in a red coat, walking quickly while scrolling through her phone, was the first to break her stride. She was about 10 feet past the piano when her steps slowed. Her thumb stopped moving on the screen. She didn't turn around at first. She just stopped walking, her head tilting slightly as if trying to place a familiar but distant sound. Then slowly she turned. She saw the old man, his back straight, his entire being focused on the keys. She leaned against a pillar, her phone forgotten in her hand. Dangling by her side dot, the music acted like a net, catching people one by one. A delivery man, pushing a cart loaded with cardboard boxes, was on a direct path that would take him right between the piano and the people starting to gather. He was humming to himself, thinking about his next stop. As he got closer, the sound of the piano cut through his own thoughts. He stopped the cart. He didn't park it. He just stopped, his hand still on the handle, and listened. His face, which had been set in a look of mild irritation, softened. He didn't move again. Two teenagers, a boy and a girl, were shoving each other playfully near a coffee kiosk, laughing loudly. The girl was mock-punching the boy's arm. The rolling, powerful chords from the piano reached them. Their play fight stalled. They stood still, looking over the heads of the growing crowd toward the source of the sound. Their laughter died away, replaced by a look of quiet awe. They didn't speak. They just moved a little closer together, shoulder to shoulder, and listened. The crowd was forming not all at once, but person by person. A businessman with a tight schedule glanced at his watch, sighed, and then paused as a particularly beautiful run of notes floated past him. He adjusted the strap of his laptop bag and took a single step to the side, finding a spot where he could see. An elderly couple, sitting on a bench with their small travel bag between them, held hands. The wife squeezed her husband's hand and nodded toward the piano. They smiled at each other, a private, understanding smile. What was happening was a kind of magic, but it was a human magic. It wasn't that the station became silent. The distant rumble of trains and the general hum never fully stopped. It was that the music created a bubble of focus. Inside that bubble, people chose to be quiet. They chose to listen. The usual noise of life, the chatter, the phone calls, the rustling of bags seemed to pull back, becoming a respectful background whisper. The piano was no longer a piece of street furniture. It was the heart of the station, and the old man was its pulse. He played with his eyes closed now. He was not performing for the 50, then 70, then nearly 100 people gathering around him. He was somewhere else. His face was a landscape of emotion. His eyebrows would draw together in concentration during a difficult passage, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then, as the music swelled into something majestic and grand, his expression would open, his head lifting slightly, as if he were seeing something magnificent just beyond the station's roof. There was a pain in his expression sometimes, a fleeting wince, but it wasn't from physical effort. It was the pain of the music itself, of whatever memory it was pulling to the surface. His hands were a dance of their own. They moved with an economy that spoke of a lifetime of practice. There was no wasted motion. They leaped from the low end of the keyboard to the high end with a grace that belied his age, his fingers finding their places without a single fumble or wrong note. You could see the muscles and tendons in his hands working, alive with the music. The old spots and veins on his skin were just part of the map of the man making this incredible sound. The piece began to build. The left-hand chords became more powerful, more insistent. The right-hand melody cried out, clear and soaring above the storm. People in the crowd found they were holding their breath. A young mother with a sleeping baby in a stroller had tears welling in her eyes, though she couldn't have said why. A tough-looking young man in a construction jacket, his hands stained with dirt, stared at the pianist with his mouth slightly open. This was not the music of his world, but he felt its power in his chest. The music reached its climax, a crashing, glorious summit of sound that filled every corner of the glass canopy. The old man's whole body was involved now, his shoulders moving with the force of the chords. And then, as quickly as it had built, it began to recede. The storm passed. The melody returned, quieter now, softer, like someone remembering a great passion from a long distance. The final notes were a series of single, deep chords, each one softer than the last, fading away into silence like a heartbeat slowing to rest. His hands came to a stop and settled gently in his lap. The last vibration of the final note faded from the piano, strings, and was swallowed by the station's ambient noise. There was a complete, profound silence from the crowd. It lasted for 5 full seconds. No one clapped. No one moved. It was as if they were all waking from a shared, powerful dream. They were afraid that any sound, even the sound of applause, would be too coarse, too loud for the space the music had created. They just stood there, united in a deep, respectful quiet, looking at the old man who still sat with his eyes closed, breathing slowly, coming back to himself in the silent heart of the city he had just stopped. The silence was not empty. It was thick, like the air just after a heavy rain. It was filled with the echo of the music that had just ended, a sound that seemed to still hang in the space above everyone's heads. For those few heartbeats, no one in the crowd moved. They were caught between the world of the music and the world of the station. Not wanting to break the spell, the old man himself seemed to be in a distant place. He kept his eyes closed, his hands resting quietly in his lap. His shoulders, which had been so straight and strong while he played, softened just a little. He took a long, slow breath, his chest rising and falling. It was the breath of someone who had just finished a long, difficult, and beautiful task. A single deep line of concentration between his eyebrows slowly smoothed away. Then he opened his eyes. He blinked, looking at the piano keys, as if seeing them for the first time. He seemed surprised to find himself there. Slowly, his awareness expanded. He turned his head just a bit to the left, then to the right. For the first time, he saw the people. A semicircle of faces watched him. There were easily over 100 now, packed tightly but quietly. More were standing on the edges, on tiptoes, peering over shoulders from behind the ticket machines and pillars. He saw the woman in the red coat, her phone dark in her hand. He saw the delivery man, still holding his cart. He saw the teenagers, no longer shoving, their faces serious. He saw the tired, the young, the old, the rich, the poor, all, the separate streams of the city pooled together into one still, silent audience. A flicker of something like embarrassment passed over his face. It was a quick, shy look. He hadn't been playing for them. He had been playing for the music, or for something or someone else entirely. This attention was unexpected. He gave a small, almost awkward nod. It wasn't a bow. It was just a slight dip of his chin, a simple acknowledgement. "I see you," it seemed to say. "Thank you for listening." He turned back to the piano. The crowd let out a collective, soft sigh, thinking he was finished. Some people shifted their weight, ready to start clapping now, ready to let the moment end and go back to their lives. But his hands rose again. This time, the music was different. The first piece had been a storm, a powerful memory from another continent, another century. This new music was like moonlight. It was gentle, liquid, and incredibly sad, but in a sweet, loving way. It was a nocturne by Frederick Chopin. The melody sang softly, a lonely voice wandering through the night, accompanied by chords that flowed like a quiet river. It was simpler, clearer, but in its own way, just as deep. If the first piece had commanded attention with its power, this one gently invited the heart to open. The change in the crowd was immediate and physical. Postures relaxed. Shoulders dropped. The intense, gripped silence became a softer, more breathable quiet. People who had been standing stiffly now leaned against each other or against the walls. The young mother with the stroller wiped a tear from her cheek without shame. The businessman loosened his tie a fraction. The old man played this piece with a different touch. His movements were smaller, more intimate. He wasn't battling the piano. He was coaxing a story from it. His right hand shaped the melody with a tenderness that was almost visible, his fingers barely brushing the keys, making them sing rather than speak. You could see the careful control in his left hand as it laid down the waltzing rhythm, steady and sure. This music did something remarkable. It didn't feel like a performance anymore. It felt like overhearing a private conversation. It felt like watching someone think out loud, their thoughts translated into sound. The man's face was unguarded. As the sweet, sorrowful melody rose and fell, a small, private smile would touch his lips, then vanish, replaced by a look of deep yearning. It was clear this music meant something very personal to him. He wasn't just playing notes on a page. He was remembering. He was speaking without words. In the crowd, people began to remember too. The elderly couple on the bench were no longer looking at the pianist. They were looking at each other, their old eyes bright. The man whispered something to his wife, and she nodded, squeezing his hand tight. Their own story was in that music somewhere. The construction worker looked down at his own rough hands, then back at the old man's agile fingers, and something in his tough expression softened into understanding. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, holding her father's hand, tugged on his fingers. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice tiny in the quiet. "Why does it feel quiet inside my ears, but loud inside my heart?" Her father, unable to find words, just put a finger to his lips with a gentle smile and picked her up, holding her so she could see. She rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes wide, watching the magic in the old man's hands. The music wove a web between everyone present. Strangers shared glances and small, understanding smiles. A well-dressed woman in heels caught the eye of a young man in a hoodie, and they both gave the same slight shrug, as if to say, "Can you believe this?" For these few minutes, the invisible walls that usually kept people apart in the city walls of hurry, of worry, of different lives, just melted away. They were just people, feeling the same thing together. The Chopin piece moved toward its end. The wandering melody found its way home. The notes became slower, more spaced apart, each one a precious, final thought. The old man played the last, lingering chord and let it fade into nothing. He kept his foot on the pedal, letting the sound breathe its last out again. He was still. But this time, the silence from the crowd was different. It wasn't stunned. It was full. It was a grateful, peaceful quiet. The magic wasn't broken. It was settled deep inside them. They watched him, waiting, not wanting to rush him, not wanting this shared dream to end. The old man looked down at his hands on the keys. He turned them over, looking at his palms as if reading something written there. Then he did something simple. He reached into the breast pocket of his worn sweater and pulled out a plain, clean, white handkerchief. He carefully, methodically, wiped the keys of the piano. It was a practical gesture, a musician's habit wiping away the moisture from his fingers. But in that moment, it felt like a ritual. It was a gentle goodbye to the instrument. He folded the handkerchief and put it back in his pocket. He placed his hands back on the keys, ready for one final conversation. He wasn't finished yet. There was one more thing to say. He placed his hands back on the keys, and for a moment there was only the expectant hush. Then he began to play again, and the sound was like a warm light switching on in a dim room. It was a tune everyone knew. The first few notes were simple, unadorned, and they traveled through the crowd with the force of a shared secret. It was As Time Goes By, the old song from the film Casablanca. But this was not the way it was usually played in hotel lounges or by street musicians. This was something else. He started slowly, thoughtfully, letting each note ring clear. It was just the melody at first, pure and simple, like someone humming a half-remembered lullaby. His touch was so gentle, it made the familiar song feel new and deeply personal. Then, his left hand joined in, not with a simple chord, but with a soft, walking bass line that gave the song a gentle, swinging heartbeat. He began to improvise, weaving little threads of harmony around the main tune, turning the simple song into a rich, textured tapestry of sound. It was jazz, but it was quiet jazz. It was blues, but it was hopeful blues. The music smiled. It had a sway to it, a tenderness that felt like a hand on the shoulder or a kiss on the forehead. The grand, stormy emotions of the Rachmaninoff and the lonely beauty of the Chopin were now wrapped in something warmer, something that spoke directly of love. A change swept through the audience. The intense, gripped silence of the first piece and the melancholy peace of the second now softened into something like recognition and joy. People's faces, which had been etched with awe or sorrow, relaxed into smiles. Small, real smiles. An older woman near the front began to sway almost imperceptibly, her eyes closed. A man who had been clutching his briefcase like a shield let it drop to his side, his shoulders finally unlocking. The old man played with his eyes open now, looking down at his hands, but his expression was different. The look of deep concentration was still there, but it was mixed with something sweeter. A light had come into his watery blue eyes. As his right hand danced over the higher keys, adding little sparkling flourishes, the ghost of a true, full smile played on his lips. It was a smile of remembrance, not of pain, but of a specific, cherished happiness. He wasn't just playing a song. He was painting a portrait with sound. You could almost see the person he was thinking of smile, a tilt of the head, a quiet moment in a sunlit room. The music built gently. It wasn't loud, but it grew fuller, richer. He added more chords, his left hand walking steadily, his right hand singing the melody with a soulful singing tone. He played a chorus that swung, then a chorus that was sweet and simple, then a final chorus where he let the melody soar, clear and beautiful, above the lovely harmony he built underneath it. It felt like a story reaching its best part, and then he began to take it home. The tempo slowed. The fancy decorations fell away. He stripped the song back down to its beautiful bare bones, just the essential melody, note by precious note. He held the penultimate chord, letting it resonate in the great space, a sound that was both happy and heartbreakingly final. His fingers found the last, resolving chord. He played it softly, perfectly. He held his foot on the pedal, letting the single, complex sound bloom and fill the station. He kept it held and held it until the sound naturally began to fade, thinning into a whisper, and then into a memory of a sound. When there was nothing left but the faintest vibration in the strings, he lifted his hands. He lowered the keyboard cover with a soft, definitive thump. The sound was like the closing of a beloved book. This time, the silence lasted only a second before it was shattered by a wave of sound. But it wasn't just applause. It was a roar. It was clapping, cheering, whistles, shouts of bravo. It was the release of 100 held breaths, the explosion of gratitude that had been building for 10 minutes. The noise was enormous, bouncing off the glass and steel of the station. People were beaming, laughing, wiping their eyes. The tough construction worker was clapping so hard his hands must have stung. The little girl in her father's arms was clapping too, her face lit up with delight. The old man seemed genuinely startled by the force of it. The color rose in his pale cheeks. He stood up from the bench, slower now, using the piano for support again. His moment of transcendent focus clearly passed. He was just an old man once more, looking shy and a little overwhelmed by the sea of cheering people. He gave another small, awkward nod, this time with a hand briefly raised in a gesture of thanks, and also, perhaps, a gentle plea for it to stop Dot as the applause began to finally subside into a sustained, warm clapping. He bent down with a slight grunt and picked up his old leather suitcase. He turned, ready to walk away, to disappear back into the stream of the city from which he'd emerged. That's when the boy moved. He was young, maybe 7 or 8, with a bright, curious face. He had been standing at the very front, his nose almost level with the edge of the piano. He darted out from the crowd, his small legs carrying him quickly to the old man's side before his parents could stop him. He tugged gently on the man's faded wool coat. The old man stopped and looked down. The boy's voice, clear and high, cut through the last of the clapping. "Mister?" The old man tilted his head, a kind look on his face. "Are you a famous pianist?" The boy asked, his eyes wide with the simple logic of childhood. Music this good must come from someone on television. A ripple of quiet laughter, warm and understanding, went through the nearest people. They leaned in, eager to hear the answer. The old man looked at the boy, and his gaze moved over the crowd, meeting the eyes of the mother, the delivery man, the elderly couple. He seemed to consider the question. He didn't speak for a long moment, and he spoke. His voice was softer than they expected, a little rough with age and disuse, but perfectly clear. "Once," he said slowly, as if recalling a fact from a history book about someone else, "a very long time ago, I played in concert halls." He paused, and his eyes lost their focus on the crowd, looking at something far away. "In many cities." A murmur of understanding passed through those who heard. It was a confirmation of what they had sensed, the profound skill, the effortless command. They were in the presence of a master, a ghost from a world of velvet seats and grand stages. The old man's eyes came back to the boy. The faraway look faded, replaced by something more immediate, more real. The gentle smile returned, truer and sadder than before. He nodded toward the piano, then gestured with his free hand to encompass the whole of the busy station, the echoing halls, the rushing people, the trains coming and going. "Now," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that the crowd had to strain to hear. "Now I play for my wife." He let that hang in the air for a heartbeat. This was her favorite station. She loved to watch the people. He gave the boy a final, small nod. He touched the brim of his faded flat cap in a gesture of old-world courtesy, not just to the boy, but to all of them. Then, without another word, he turned. He adjusted his grip on his little suitcase, and he walked slowly but steadily into the moving crowd. The people parted for him, a respectful channel opening up in the river of humanity. He didn't look back. In seconds, the gray coat and the flat cap were absorbed into the blur of jackets and bags and hats, and he was gone as quietly as he had arrived. For a long moment, no one moved. The space where the old man had stood felt charged, like the air after a lightning strike. The applause had ended, But the silence that returned was different from before. It wasn't the hungry silence of waiting, or the deep silence of being lost in music. It was a soft, thoughtful silence, a shared silence. People looked at each other, not with the blank stares of strangers, but with a kind of recognition. They had been through something together. The elderly couple on the bench stayed seated, the man's arm now around his wife's shoulders, holding her close. They were in no rush. The woman in the red coat finally looked down at her phone, not to use it, but to turn it off completely, sliding it into her pocket as if putting away a distraction she no longer needed. Slowly, carefully, the crowd began to disperse. But it wasn't the usual frantic scattering. People drifted away like leaves settling after a wind. Their steps were slower. Their faces were turned inward, thoughtful. Many glanced back at the piano, which sat quiet and black under the canopy, looking ordinary again. And yet not ordinary at all. That the little boy who had asked the question was led away by his father. But he kept twisting his head to look back, his small face serious with a new kind of wonder. The construction worker hoisted his bag onto his shoulder, gave a last long look at the piano bench, and walked off toward his site, his step a little less heavy. The delivery man finally pushed his cart forward, the wheels squeaking, continuing his delayed route. The piano remained. It was the quiet center of this slowly returning noise. The station's normal soundscape, the echoing announcements, the chatter, the rolling suitcase wheels seeped back in, but it felt muted, less urgent out then. Something happened. A young man, maybe in his 20s, with a guitar case on his back, approached the piano. He had been at the very back of the crowd, watching. He stood next to the bench, his hand hovering over the lid, just as the old man's had. He looked at the keys. He glanced at the people still milling nearby. He seemed to think better of it. He shook his head, almost smiling to himself, gave the piano a respectful pat on its side, and walked on. He understood. This was not his moment to play. Throughout the afternoon, others would come near. A teenage girl, excited, sat down and put her fingers on the keys. But before she played a note, she looked around. She saw people watching her, not with anticipation, but with a quiet, protective look. She saw the elderly couple still on their bench, smiling at her kindly, but with an unspoken message. She blushed, took her hands off the keys, and simply closed the lid gently before getting up. It wasn't that she couldn't play. It was that the instrument felt sacred now, and her pop song would feel like shouting in a library. The piano became a monument. For the rest of that day, it was played only by the memory of the old man's music. Commuters walking past would reach out and touch its smooth wood, not to open it, but just to make contact. Some would pause for a full minute, just standing there, listening to the echo of a melody only they could hear in their heads. It was as if he had left a piece of his spirit in the instrument, and people were careful not to disturb it. The story began to travel, but in a broken, human way. It wasn't a single viral post. It was 100 small conversations. That evening, in a cozy apartment across the city, the woman in the red coat was making dinner. Her partner asked about her day. "Nothing special," she started to say, then stopped. She put down the knife. Actually, something amazing happened. And she told the story, struggling to find words for the feeling. It was like he played what being old feels like, and what love feels like, too. At a family dinner table, the little boy told his mother and sister about the magic man at the station who played music that made everyone stop. He played for his wife, Mom, in the station with all the people. His mother, puzzled but touched, brushed his hair from his forehead. The businessman, still on his late train home, didn't open his laptop. He stared out the dark window, seeing not his own reflection, but the old man's hands on the keys. He made a silent promise to dig out his own old guitar from the closet that weekend. The two teenagers texted their friends, but the texts were frustrating. "You had to be there," one wrote. "It wasn't just the music. It was like everything." Days passed. The station returned to its normal rhythm. The piano was played again. A week later, a group of university students gathered around it and sang a popular song loudly and cheerfully, and people smiled and threw coins in an open case. The spell, it seemed, was broken, but it wasn't, not really. It had just settled deeper. The old man was never seen again. No one found out his name, or which concert halls he had played in, or where he went when he walked away. He became a beloved ghost story of the city, a story not of fear, but of beauty. People who had been there would sometimes say to a friend, as they passed through the station, "See that piano? Something incredible happened there once." And they would tell the story, each in their own way. The true change was invisible. It lived in the pauses. A tired nurse, rushing through the station on her way to a double shift, heard a few notes from a child plinking the piano. Instead of irritation, she felt a sudden, unexpected smile. She remembered the old man, and for a second, her hurry didn't seem so vital. A taxi driver, stuck in traffic, found himself humming a fragment of a classical tune he didn't know the name of, a piece that had haunted him since an afternoon. His passenger had told him a strange story about a station piano. The city didn't become a different place. It was still loud and busy and often lonely. But in its heart, under the glass canopy of the main station, a space had been carved out. A space where people remembered that inside the rushing crowds were lives full of secret stories, of great talent and great love, of quiet grief and quiet joy. The old man had given them a gift. It wasn't just a free concert. He had given them a shared moment of grace. He had reminded them that beauty doesn't always shout. Sometimes it arrives quietly in a worn coat, speaks in a language without words, and reminds every single person listening that they have a heart that can be stirred. And in that reminder, for a few minutes, the city wasn't a machine of steel and schedules. It was just a room full of people, breathing together, feeling together, connected by the simple, profound truth of a song played for a lost love in a crowded place. That truth lingered. It lingered in the air, in the memory of the music, and in the newfound willingness of 1,000 strangers to believe, if only for a moment, in the magic of an unplanned pause.